Well, it is that time once again to be celebrating Doctor Who's 60th anniversary over at Big Finish in the 6th instalment of Once and Future entitled Time Lord Immemorial, as written by Lisa McMullen. And this is the episode that I have been waiting for, with Christopher Eccleston and David Warner. How exciting indeed. This release is of course available to order now on the Big Finish official website on both physical CD and digital download. It was also available as a part of a limited edition bundle alongside exclusive cover artwork, extended behind the scenes, I do believe an extended booklet as well, as was of course also being personally delivered to your house by Tom Baker himself. Naturally this is sold out and it was limited edition to 3,000 units. So I have in fact been intending to review the story for quite a number of weeks, but I got COVID, meaning that I couldn't talk, so I'm back now, and I'm back reviewing and catching up of all the delightful audio dramas that have came out over the past month. So this story is a rather unusual one, because it has basically been unofficially announced now for quite a number of months, and without a doubt is the episode within this series that I have been most looking forward to, for obvious reasons. Hearing the one and only David Warner alongside Christopher Eccleston's Ninth Doctor, what a surreal, exciting moment. And I'm happy to say that this episode also finally starts to ramp up the whole arc of this series, which admittedly I do wish happened many releases ago. And of course at this point within the review, I would like to say if you haven't checked out my previous reviews of Once and Future, I highly recommend doing so in order to get my opinion of this series so far. So the sands of time are running out and the Doctor is on the hunt for psionic sand. He is still suffering from the big arc of the series being the degeneration problem, meaning time, identity, memories and characters are all a little bit out of whack. Universes collide and one of the best Doctors ever meets one of the best Doctors ever. Liv is also enjoying a little bit of sun on the holiday planet of Solaris Hexis, however this is soon disrupted by the Lumiat as they are hunted by sand creatures throughout space and time. But what does all of this have to do with the Time Lord Immemorial? One thing is certain, they must stop the universes from colliding. And to anyone who is not very aware of Big Finish, or if you haven't really listened to many releases, then you're probably thinking that that was a lot of names and words which mean very little sense, which I do try to bear in mind that this series is aimed at a more accessible audience, those who maybe haven't listened to as much Big Finish for the many different series that they create. So naturally this episode does contain lots of characters that I personally am very familiar with, however those may not be. So this episode does feature lots of introductions to kind of get that ball rolling, which I think is nice, although for those of you that have already been introduced to these characters before, it does take a little bit of a while to get going. I've commented on rather odd pairings within this series so far, in particular with Two's Company that was also written by Lisa McMullen. Lisa's very lucky, she's written 2 episodes within this series, but you know, we'll let her off because we do like Lisa, her episodes are great, and I think that Lisa has done a superb job within this story of absolutely making the dynamics work and give reasoning behind them, which I think is something that hasn't particularly worked for some of the previous episodes within this series. This one feels absolutely right. It uses it to its advantage. This episode to me is also the closest that Once and Future has got to a proper Big Finish territory story, with most of the other releases still relying somewhat on TV show characters, so naturally I did feel more at home with this story. Rather frustratingly, I do think because of that, a lot of the episodes within this series so far have kind of fell into the category of being very easy listens. I think that this episode does definitely have more levels to it. It's lots of universe ending stuff, which does feel very big in scale, perfect for this point within the series. But at the same time, I think that this episode, as well as The Artist at the End of the Universe, or whatever that story is called, where Colin is the curator, I kind of feel like both of them sit on a little bit of a podium as being the Big Finish, or the type of Big Finish that I like, and then the rest of the stories kind of fall into the still enjoyable category, but almost too easy of a listen, and it doesn't really bridge sort of the exciting experimental nature that I expect from a Big Finish story. So of course Liv Chenka has lots of knowledge about the Doctor already, and it's a thrill seeing a Big Finish established companion integrating wholly into an anniversary story. I wish it was done more throughout this series, to be honest. Nicola Walker's performances as Liv have been something that I've really come to love in recent years, and it's such a privilege having a name like hers as a regular within the Doctor Who universe, as she is essentially a household name, and it's excellent the Big Finish are still creating stories with her. And for those interested, this is Liv Chenka during the events of Doom Coalition and Ravenous, so prior to the events of Stranded, meaning she hasn't met Tanya or the Ninth Doctor yet within the Ninth Doctor Adventures episode Flat Pack. If you were going to be picky, you could have had literally any companion fill the role within this story, but I think Lisa's writing, twinned with Nicola's performance, makes her presence within this episode enjoyable, albeit not essential. Bringing the Lumiat into the narrative right after the events of the Martian invasion of Planetoid 50 is also a great thematic choice. Gina McKee, of course, starred alongside Christopher Eccleston in Our Friends in the North back in 1995 and 1996, and the dynamic that they share within this story is quick, snappy, but also full of energy. It felt like a proper treat, allowing these two actors to share that audio stage together. The Lumiat has lots of fun lines, and her relationship and dynamic with the Warner Doctor is very interesting, and I think it was quite fun sort of hearing them say, "You're not my master, I'm not your doctor," and all of that is just a really fun way to kind of take this story, but also match that with the Lumiat's determination to make a friendship with the Ninth Doctor, and then that making him feel incredibly awkward because she's very open and he's quite reserved. Personally, I'm not quite sold on the concept of the Lumiat yet. I think I've listened to one story with her in the past, and there is another episode from Missy Volume 2 I think that I've yet to listen to, so maybe I need to give the character more of a go, as I must admit within this story, so I don't know how new listeners feel who've never been introduced to the character before, but within this story I still don't really feel like I know the Lumiat or fully understand the concept of what she is actually meant to be. She's great though, I enjoy listening to her, she's very bizarre and you kind of want to go for a cup of tea with her in a very quirky cafe, but at the same time I don't quite get what she is or why. Probably why. I think that more why. Why is she there? That's the main thing for me. I can't really get out of my mind that it kind of stops me from fully appreciating the character. And also the very big thing with this story, it's very, very exciting having actual Christopher Eccleston within an actual Doctor Who anniversary episode. And much like the other stories, this release shares the novelty of hearing the not quite Ninth Doctor refer to things that occur outside of his era within the future, such as new series references or talking about Missy, which does feel rather unusual. And this release does also feel very different to the other stories within the range. We don't have any smaller appearances or cameos from the other classic series Doctors, which does make this episode stylistically feel very different from the other stories. 9 remains somewhat stable throughout, and I like the way that Lisa has worked this into the narrative. It makes sense, although it still kind of feels a bit odd. And it does also stick with that thing that Christopher Eccleston said at a convention at one point, that the Ninth Doctor is someone who very much does things by himself. And to be honest, I'm not really keen on seeing the Ninth Doctor meet any other incarnations, certainly from new series Doctor Who. I'm kind of okay with him being by himself. Although when you bring the Warner Doctor into the equation, that's a bit of an exception because of the nature of his Doctor, and I like the fact that they've brought them together. So as I mentioned, the degeneration concept is addressed in different ways throughout this story. The episode focuses more on the time unravelling aspects of the plot, and again this is logical given that we are very nearly at the end of this series. I think that it is hugely beneficial for the arc's actual plot, because we've not really heard much of the actual plot arc throughout the rest of the stories within the range that kind of contribute to the Doctor's overall big mission. But with one episode to go out of this core run of stories, I do worry that this main development has been left a little bit too late, with most of the previous stories dealing with their own isolated plots, offering kind of little clues and things like that as to where the Doctor should travel next, which for me isn't enough to keep me fully hooked. I definitely would have liked to see the previous episodes within the run generally feel a lot more connected rather than being rather isolated overall. The narrative does rely on visual description quite a bit, lots of sci-fi technobabble with location hopping and trips to the Time Lord Immemorial, and that is of course a place of legend, a singularity where all time is kept and every moment that ever was is kind of filed away. And yes, I did take that description directly from the story itself, just so I could actually understand what was going on. It is one of those stories that I do recommend giving your full attention to, as if you zone out for even a few minutes or even a few seconds, you'll find yourself in a wholly new location, maybe even with different characters, and you won't really know what's going on. There's lots of location hopping, especially with the technobabbly stuff added in as well. It's not particularly my favourite type of story style or format. It's something of which that I don't really gel with too much. I think that if it wasn't for the characters within this story, I definitely wouldn't have got along with this episode as much as I did. If it was characters that I kind of really needed to grow to and like, then I really wouldn't have got along with this story. But the fact that Warner and Nine is there made everything okay, even though I still didn't really know what was going on. So this review is essentially going to be in two parts, and we're moving into that second part now, which is entirely dedicated to the late, great David Warner, who sadly passed away a number of months ago. He is an absolute acting powerhouse and one of my personal favourite doctors of all time. I've absolutely adored listening to his stories at Big Finish over the past few years, and it is utterly heartbreaking that we won't be hearing any more adventures from him. What David Warner brings to the table as the Doctor is many of the great traits that I expect from an incarnation, and I think that he is such an enjoyable character to listen to. The whole origins of his incarnation came from an incredibly troubled place, and his relationship with Bernice Summerfield, or as he affectionately refers to her as simply just Summerfield, is so warm and caring, which I'm not even exaggerating when I say I do think it is genuinely one of the best duos in the entirety of Doctor Who canon. David Warner brings to this story that same magic and mystery that he brings to his delightful adventures with Benny. He has so much charm, but you absolutely wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of him. As expected, the Once and Future plot does take prominence within this story, and selfishly, I wish it didn't. I want to take this Doctor on so many adventures that sadly we will now no longer be able to hear, and it's not this story's fault that this is Warner's final performance within the role. And it does somewhat frustrate me that he isn't front and centre of the story, but hearing him alongside Nine definitely brought a smile to my face on many occasions throughout listening, so I'm really grateful for that. I'm also grateful that it was able to happen in the first place, as it is so magical. Having these two together is a dream come true. Something that I also love is that this isn't really a multi-Doctor story that you would expect. It doesn't have those cheesy points like I am you are me, yay. Instead, it's kind of like two experts, like that admire each other, coming together for the first time. That appreciation for acting between Eccleston and Warner does almost break that fourth wall ever so slightly. These are two acting greats doing what they do best. The Warner Doctor absolutely deserves acknowledgement, and he deserves to be a part of Doctor Who's 60th anniversary, and he deserves to be centre stage, and I'm so grateful that he got to be a part of this journey. I don't usually comment on final scenes or story endings, but given the outer context beyond Once and Future, and especially given my appreciation of this incarnation, I think it is only fair. It says goodbye to David Warner's Doctor in a really fitting way, as it's not a goodbye. He is in his TARDIS, in what I presume is maybe set within the new adventures of Bernice Summerfield Volumes 3 and 4, and they're about to go on a new adventure, this Doctor and his best friend. This nicely also maintains the ending to Volume 7 of Bernice Summerfield Blood and Steel. Again, this ending wasn't an absolute ending, but an open ending, which I think is a perfect way to end this journey, that Bernice and this Doctor are going to be travelling together for as long as possible, and when we next time see Benny, she's probably left the Doctor behind, but we don't quite know how many adventures that they've been on together. I do think, however, that Time Lord Immemorial does definitely miss a potentially beautiful opportunity, and due to it kind of hopping between different spaces and planets and whooshing psionic sand creatures everywhere, there is less sitting around time, and personally, I would have really loved to see Once and Future's arc kind of just paused just for a moment, allowing these two Doctors to come together and reflect. The Ninth Doctor is a loner, he's not travelling with anyone, the Time War is over and Gallifrey has been destroyed. Meanwhile, you have David Warner's Unbound Doctor that has come directly from a universe where everything is dying and collapsing. Both of these Doctors in the present moment are experiencing loss on an extreme scale, arguably more loss than any other incarnations of the Doctors have faced, and yet sadly there's not really any discussion about that, and admittedly I hold my hands up and say we're probably not going to have a casual mention to the fact that David Warner's Doctors came from a universe that's completely dying, because that's kind of a plot point from a series that Big Finish produce somewhere else entirely within the catalogue, and that will probably daunt listeners who have never even heard of this incarnation, let alone the universe that he's came from. So I can definitely understand why they've done that, but for those listeners who have came from the David Warner stories, kind of that other side of the listening barrier, I do feel like this story definitely misses on a very powerful moment. And of course, when you throw into the mix as well that this Ninth Doctor isn't really the Ninth Doctor, so although we are dealing somewhat with the Time War theme, this isn't a Ninth Doctor dealing with the full-on loss of the Time War just yet. So yeah, in a way, the Once and Future theme of the series actually prevents it and lets it down for having this really powerful moment. You could have even had the Warner Doctor sort of encouraging Nine to go and find a friend, because the Warner Doctor was very similar to Nine at the beginning. He was very miserable, he was very much alone, he didn't like the company of people, people, and then he met Bernice. 9 needs to find his own equivalent to Bernice, i.e. Rose Tyler, but hey, this episode couldn't do that, which is a shame, but I'll try not to hold it against it. So there we are, that is it for this story. I think that it's an unusual one. I found it really, really enjoyable, and it definitely was the type of fan service that I love. Although I think the techno-babbly stuff did somewhat let it down at points, but I think that it absolutely used the characters to their maximum potential. The Lumiat is an interesting concept, although admittedly I'm personally not fully on board with it just yet. Livchenko was incredibly enjoyable. I think that this story is a perfect example of what Once and Future sadly hasn't been doing since the beginning. I think that it would have been nice to have more episodes like this, which use characters in a similar way to this episode, although it won't be a story for everyone, especially if you're not quite on board with the theme of this series as a whole. So there we are, that's it for Time Lord Immemorial. Next up within this review series, we have the 7th and final episode of the core run of stories prior to Coda, which is of course coming in 2024, and the final story is of course entitled The Union. But before we finish off this review, I would like to end off with one of the quotes mentioned by Christopher Eccleston within the interviews, as it's something lovely. He says that if any actor should have played the Doctor, it's David Warner. I really think that, and I couldn't agree more. So yes, thank you David Warner for the adventures.